Ryan Jeffrey, and this is the Passionate About OSS podcast. It's episode 2, and the purpose of the Passionate About OSS podcast is to shine a light on some of the brilliant minds in OSS and telecommunications industry. A little bit about the people's background and the great knowledge, tips and techniques that they can hopefully share with us. Today's guest is Peter Dutt. Pete is Chief Architect of Synchronoss, been with Spatial Info, which then became Synchronoss, or is now bannered under Synchronoss, and has been working with that team for around 20 plus years. Pete is what I refer to as a tripod thinker in OSS and telco, and tripods are some of the most valuable people that I've found in the industry because they have the ability to bring in the concepts of IT, networks and operations and business all together and make sense of that. And that really helps lead the teams that work with them. And Pete's also been a real go-to contact for me within the outside plant aspect of OSS and physical network inventory. So welcome to Peter Dutt.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Ryan. I feel privileged. Quite an introduction you've given me there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But you started off as a mathematician by your study and a developer, but obviously there's a lot more in the background there that perhaps you'd like to elaborate on a little bit.
All right. Well, if we start right back at the beginning, I did maths at university, and kind of fell into programming. But really, I only picked maths because I wasn't very good at English, and I wasn't very good at writing when I was a kid. I was kind of a slow developer, actually. As soon as I got to A levels or VCSEs, or the equivalent are, I kind of hit my straps and made it to university and got a degree in maths. But yeah, I think I've always been interested in tinkering with computers and things, and always been keen to take things apart. And I don't know, that was my early childhood, was fiddling with stuff and breaking it, and I don't know, building go-karts and things like that. So it was kind of engineering from the ground up, from nuts and bolts and planks and things. Was my very early days. But when it gets interesting, and is that I arrived in Australia even longer ago as a backpacker with very little money, and ended up doing a job which was collecting field data for a mining survey company. And that involved lots of running around the bush and collecting data, and it was quite adventurous out there in the wilds of the outback and Northern Territories and things. But as a result of that, I actually got into processing some geophysical data, and that would have been in early 90s. And the reason that's important is that we started kind of converting the data into maps. So I got into early GIS products and imaging bits of software. And that was, my path into OSS and telecommunications was via geophysics and map production. So that's how I ended up in spatial info. But yeah, it was quite a while ago.
Yeah, indeed. So spatial info was the first real step in the OSS journey, but it really transitioned across from the GIS type background that you had.
That's right. Yeah. So I did before telco. The company was really focused in on geophysical data, and I worked with CSIRO and travelled all over the place, processing quite a lot of really interesting maps. Actually, one of my claims to fame is I wrote some very early software. It wasn't actually that sophisticated, but it allowed two of these kind of images. They were intended to be things like magnetic maps. So people had flown magnetic surveys, but allowed two of these to be joined together, and we had some feathering and smoothing algorithms. So really, it was a very early something like Photoshop. You could click two images together and join them, but it was used by CSIRO to produce the first image of the complete image of Australia's magnetic background. And on one of my visits to Canberra, I walked into the foyer of this big office, and there was a really big map. It was probably 2 or 3 meters by 2 or 3 meters, even probably bigger than that. And the guy pointed at it and said, "You did that, your software did that." And, mine did little parts of it. He'd sat there for months joining all these little patchwork things together with my software, but it had produced this amazing image.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And how did you originally meet with the Spatial Info team, and how big were they? How old were they at the time?
Yeah, so I was just a contractor and started as a programmer under the tutelage of Jeff Lang, who's still there today. And but yeah, I when I joined, there were probably maybe somewhere around 10, 18 programmers there in the dev team. But it was very much a small Australian company. And the background for Spatial Info is really, it was founded by Tony Cotter and some of his business partners. But they, early on in the 80s, they wrote a piece of software called CPR, which was picked up by Telstra. So they had a strong backing, and really the original ideas in CPR, which stood for Cable Plant Records for Telstra, have made it into Spatial Net, which was the main product of Spatial Info. And really, whilst not much of the code transitioned across from CPR, in fact, none of it, the kind of ideas behind where the product fits in the market and what it was, the scope of what it was trying to do originated from those initial versions with Telstra.
And was it an easy transition to make over from what you had been doing to then coming across the Spatial Info?
Well, interesting you asked that question that way. That I'd come from a background of data processing. That was what I'd been doing, scientific data, and a lot of the data we're now dealing with in Oracle, because behind SpatialNet is an Oracle database, and really it's the part that helped me was I'd done a little bit of kind of modeling in my previous job, and that became a real central part of my role, or early role within Spatial Info. And that's probably the key to SpatialNet, is the richness of what we call the model, which is how we interpret the world and put it into our database and model those physical assets that SpatialNet deals with.
And was that largely defined already at that stage, or did you have a big input into the way that data was modelled?
I think bits of it were defined, but a lot of the work was finishing the model, or extending the model. There was the basics were in place, so we had an idea about how we wanted to model something like a pole or a manhole, and it was putting that into our new system and making sure it all worked together with things like the ducts and the cables and how that was all going to work together. So some of the ideas were there. It was fleshing them out, putting meat on the bones of the ideas.
Did that come intuitively, I guess, just understanding the ducts and poles and all of those relationships and data hierarchies?
I wouldn't say intuitively, but it's one of the traits I look for when we're hiring people and when we're interviewing, and the people who've done well in the company have had this ability to kind of pull things apart a little bit and understand. And it's that, I've got teenage kids, and it's always a context, don't just leap into something. It's have a look around and see if you fully understand it before you try and embark on this thing. But it's context, being aware of how the thing you're developing needs to fit in with the rest of the system, and what purpose it has. When you don't just write a program. It's a real bad mistake to get somebody to design a program and specify it all out and hand it on to somebody to develop, where the developer doesn't really have a clue how the big picture all fits together. So,
yeah, absolutely. And in those early days, were you already covering all the different network types, so the copper, fiber, HFC?
It's interesting that we had one of our key first customers was a small fiber to the home company in Sacramento. So that was very early on probably even before the dot-com kind of boom, or during the dot-com boom. So that would have been early 2000. And I can't remember the name of the guy who worked there, but he had a very kind of spelled out. It was actually how he wanted the whole of his OSS to work together. And I remember thinking that was the first time I'd talked to customers. And look, we've got we had many wonderful customers, and really you learn a lot from your customers. But this guy had a vision for how he wanted his bits of software to work together, and we focused in on fiber to the home and the fiber model, and making sure that was really solid as part, very early on in the history of SpatialNet. So that fiber was one of the stronger parts, still is, of the SpatialNet offering. RF and copper came along later. And in fact, there was a slight predecessor of SpatialNet, which is the main product now, which was an ISP product that kind of got folded into SpatialNet at one point as well.
Very interesting. So when you joined, it was only a handful of people, but how big would Spatial Info / Synchronoss be these days?
Yes, well, so the story is that Spatial Info was acquired, I think it was 2012 or somewhere around there, 12, 13, by Synchronoss. Synchronoss are a much larger company. They're listed on the NASDAQ. And I can put a link in the feed about the company itself. But the Synchronoss really hit the news by developing some software which was linked or used as part of the iPhone 3 activation back in, I've got that written down somewhere, but I think it was about 2003 or maybe 2006. But around the time when iPhones really launched, Synchronoss provided a piece of software which assisted and sped up the activation. So every single phone that was activated in the US went through that Synchronoss software, and really gave the company a really high profile, and spurred the way to quite a few acquisitions and things. So we were one of the acquisitions. So I've changed from working in what was essentially a small Australian family company to quite a large company. So I think there are about 3,000 employees in Synchronoss in the various parts of the world. Large development team in Bangalore, head office in New Jersey, and other offices scattered in various parts of the world, including Australia.
So I guess over that time too, and particularly in recent years, you've really looked to evolve the product into different areas. Are you able to describe a little bit about the products and yeah, I guess why they're valuable and who they're valuable to?
The main product that's developed in our division of the company is SpatialNet, or that's the historic engineering tool. So that's an engineering tool that the front end view of the network is based in a map format, so that's where the spatial name comes in, and it's the traditional client has been AutoCAD, and it was a thick client for many years. That was the main way we delivered spatial solutions, was through SpatialNet. Around probably 10 years ago now, we started developing Spatial Storm, which is our service-oriented platform, and started looking at web services. So I've been involved in several projects that have used Spatial Storm to integrate and share that data that's held within Spatial Suite out to other parts of the OSS system, and provide data to other platforms. So these days, SpatialNet is still one of the main parts of the software, but that old thick client is rapidly being, well, not replaced, but there's still a place for an engineering client. But we're now looking at a lot more lightweight clients, browser-based solutions, and certainly automation through Spatial Storm, and integration with other tools. So one of the projects I was heavily involved in was with the stand-up of NBN. So SpatialNet was selected as, or Spatial Suite, I should say, was selected as the main physical network inventory system for the NBN rollout here in Australia. And that was a really exciting project to work on, because it really went from zero, there was nothing there, to having to stand up a system in a matter of weeks and start loading data, and then really very quickly had to start putting customers through and activations, and really making sure that we had a system that was automated. So you worked on that with me on one of those projects as well.
Yeah, indeed I did. And I guess too, the evolution of the product has also allowed you to go after an important additional persona. So I guess traditionally for the designers and the planners and those kind of personas, but also with the more modern architecture, gives you access to, or gives you the potential to build more tools for the mobility and the actual field workers who interact with the data more directly, rather than the old A0, A1 type sheets and markups. But now it's becoming more of a mobility solution, I imagine.
That's right, yeah. So we're getting a lot of interest in little apps that you can have on your phone that bring up a splice drawing, or you can walk past a pole and say, hey, this one needs a bit of an audit, do a bit of a markup. So there's a whole bunch of little apps that are coming, but they're really the key to all these little applications, mobile devices, offline devices, comes from the power of Spatial Storm. That's our OSS platform that provides all the web services behind those tools.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the network that you're actually managing is quite passive in nature. So therefore, it doesn't have an API that you can integrate to. So, and it's always been a challenge in that space around data quality, because you can't easily reconcile. Are you also developing tools, or seeing other tools come onto the market that assist with that, such as image recognition, or QR codes or barcodes to be able to quickly identify assets, particularly in something like a pit where you may have multiple cables or multiple splice boxes or similar.
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head, really, that because everything's passive, it's really hard to query it and work out what it is and where it is. And there is an element of relying on this data. When you send somebody out into the field, they need to know exactly which manhole to go to, which splice to open up, and which cable if they're going to be making changes. And sometimes they open up the manhole, and really there's very little markings on those cables, and it's worn off, or the labels that were attached have faded, and maybe it's up a pole, and just the weather or the snow and ice have worn these labels off. And I mean, you can sometimes attach a device and send a signal down and work out which port it's hitting, but it's really quite primitive, and the tools that they've got are limited. One thing, I've been talking to a company recently who are using the vibrations from things like cars and maybe even a jackhammer, and they're managing to pick up some of those signals through the fiber cables and do several things with it. First of all, if there's a jackhammer going off near your fiber cable, that may set an alarm off, and you might want to go and check whether there was a dial before you did query or something like that in the same location. But they can triangulate these signals, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff there. So they claim they can also maybe correct locations of cables too. So I'm interested in that space. Been talking to them. We'll see what happens. But there are some interesting technologies coming online. Things like barcodes and QR codes. You're relying on people putting the labels on, and a lot of the existing cables that are out there and network simply, were badly done, or the names have changed, all sorts of things. Through acquisitions, people lose data. But ultimately, that's one of the things I'm really keen on, passionate about, as you would say, is data quality, and trying to provide good quality data to people, and so they can do their job. Really, that's the aim of the game here.
Some of those are really fascinating concepts too. Often we find that those data records are so old, they may have come from a drawing that was done 30 or 40 years ago. And so having the ability to come back now and use that technology is based around the learnings from the mining industry, I understand. So the kind of sonar, ground penetration radar type technologies.
Watch the space, see how it goes. I think there's interesting things there, especially if they can get it running on some of the like as a software. So you can virtualize it onto different boxes and do a quick check on, because when you look at some of the cities, I was looking at and bit of the network around, I think it was Seattle or somewhere, and just almost every street in central Seattle has a fiber cable going down it, and that was just one company's data, and there's multiple companies operating in there, and there's so many cables out there, and keeping track of them all and understanding exactly what you've got in the ground is really important, particularly when we start moving more towards things like automation and these virtualized networks that are auto switching and moving between different circuits. There's a lot of focus on the active parts of the network that can perform these switches, but in between those actives are kilometers of fiber cable and passive network that you're relying on maybe old records, or somebody, worst case is a pile of spreadsheets somewhere and some hand-drawn maps. But one of the things we've been really diligent with SpatialNet is having tools to collect all that information and try and bring it into the central repository and manage it in one place.
Yeah, and really becomes a really valuable asset for things like you touched on dial before you dig, which is an Australian concept of the utilities and where their underground cable assets are,
yeah.
Which brings in comms, but also power and water and sewerage and so forth. It's a really interesting industry to work within. So it's one of the key benefits I see in the outside plant is really around the geospatial representation of data and representation of an organization's assets. How do you see that, or what are some of the use cases that you really see around the geolocation and proximity that the customers tend to need, and maybe even some of the weird and wonderful ones that maybe people don't understand so often or aren't used so regularly that you think are quite powerful?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the ones that spring to mind when you talk about things like that were we recently migrated some data into the system, and it was a small, or not small, a medium-sized kind of data center. Had several floors of racks, several hundred racks. The racks were divided into rooms and 2 floors, but it was quite a large building. And we were showing the customer how the data looked, and there's several ways we can theme these views. And one of the themes that we showed was just space utilization. So our model calculates, we've got a rough idea of how high each shelf or chassis is within the rack, and we were showing them which racks were full and which ones were empty, and that was a themed view. So it's just a color coding view of the footprint. But the customer was quite surprised by how many racks were actually full and or didn't have any considerable space, less than 10% space in them. And we had to bring up several rack elevation views to prove that these rooms, that there was essentially it's supposed to be a building with a lot of spare capacity. Several of the rooms didn't actually have as much capacity as he had thought.
Yeah, and I guess the implication is also the power and heat and cooling and so forth that's also needed.
Yeah. So that was and even another one is that customer was keen on weight as well. So there's one I hadn't considered, but apparently there's weight restrictions on the floors of this building, and they added weights for all their pieces of equipment, and sure, it does add up a lot. So weight restrictions on those too. But the standard heating and cooling and power for a data center, and just theming it. But I think it's a bit like me and my CSIRO picture of Australia. Sometimes you need the big picture, and you can look at information in rows and tables, but it's summarizing it and presenting it in a way that's digestible for something like a whole building, and being able to easily spot something that's wrong, just like that color coding exercise. That was a simple one, but the second one where geolocation is really important is diversity. And I'm sure many people know about diversity, but it's something that is important. Accidents do happen, cable cuts do happen, and when they're supposed to be diverse, and sometimes they started off diverse, and one way or another, they've ended up non-diverse over time. And it's funny. I was literally doing yet another diversity project just an hour before this call. So we're using some new technology. Actually, it's quite interesting. Probably go off on a tangent here, but we're using a graph database to track the traditional connections we have in Oracle. Oracle is a relational database, and despite the name relational in there, it's not hugely efficient at traversing all those relationships, particularly when you've got massive data sets. So some of our customers have, national data sets of across America, and we've got NBN with all the assets in Australia in the database, and trying to traverse many tables with lots of relationships in Oracle can actually, you can go slow on that. And that's one of the areas these new graph databases are really efficient at.
Absolutely.
The little calculation I'm performing at the moment is using some of the new data science algorithms that are available on these graph databases to perform calculations that really you wouldn't even have attempted in Oracle. So one of them is a diversity check, and I'm bulk tracing all the important circuits for this customer, and I'm able to tell them which ones are really diverse and which ones are really not diverse. And even though their names indicate they're primary and protected, sometimes they travel down the same cables,
same duct or something.
Same duct, yeah. And I started off my intro to graph was thinking I just put the fiber data in there, but as soon as you put the fiber data in, you think, oh, maybe I should have the support structures in there, and then once you got the support structures, you think maybe we should have the roads as well, and the addresses and the buildings, and suddenly we've got a lot of data in there, but it means we can now do route finding down roads as well as support structures. But yes, I can now tell you if you've got two cables on the same road as well as two cables in the same duct. So some of those, there's several, I'm sure you've got anecdotes as well, but there's lots of stories of outages and how things can go wrong when diverse circuits are not diverse.
So, Peter, I guess another one of the use cases that I think of due to the broad nature of the way that you can use it is having the proximity or the ability to put a polygon or a lasso around assets geospatially and then run use cases off that, whether they be for marketing or for operations or design teams. Perhaps tell us a little bit about some of those use cases that you do and have seen done.
Yeah, well, it's a really important part of how our software works and really how the industry works and the life cycle that data and plant and designs and the networks themselves go through. It's that people build the networks in little boundaries, and you've got to know which addresses are in which boundaries for marketing purposes. You've got to know whether which amplifiers belong to which node in an RF node. A lot of it boils down to how's this object connected? How does it fit into the bigger network? And
where customers connect, which assets customers are connecting to.
There are so many of the use cases that the serviceability, the feasibility of whether a service can be fed to a customer, rely on understanding where that object is. And that's where, the mapping and having a map view is really important. And, when I started with spatial info, that was a distinction. One of the real differentiators about spatial info was that it had this, what we at that stage called a seamless map view. And it was like, you can keep on panning and we just add more content into the map. now that the world's got Google Maps, it doesn't actually feel that different. But at the time, it was people were used to working with drawings, and you get to the edge of a drawing, and you don't really know what's on the other side of the map. You had to hunt around and find map 2B and see who was working on that and whether they'd made changes. So these days, people are a lot more. GIS has really become common, and people use it everywhere. SpatialNet, is much more than a GIS. I'd say the model behind what people interact with, there's probably 60% of it is aspatial, and it's the fibers, it's the splicers, the splice trays that we don't tend to visualize in a map context, but it's all the little parts that go to make up the big picture. Understanding how things fit into boundaries, and really the ability to kind of cascade a boundary from one state to another. So you might have an area that's been designed or maybe upgraded for some higher bandwidth broadband. Being able to do a design in that area whilst keeping the old services going, and then roll over and switch it over to the new services, and then market them to the people in that area, all relies on managing what's inside a boundary and what's not inside a boundary.
Not obviously too, for operational context like cable cuts and so forth, just understanding where they may come into play, and particularly when they're married up with remote fiber test type kit. Perhaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an argument for, we're back on diversity again, but the cable cuts happen a lot. Maybe people, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there's probably tens of them happening in a network like Telstra's every day. And a lot of them are actually, almost friendly fire. They're accidental cuts that maybe the record's out of date and it says this fiber's spare, and somebody comes along and snips the fiber. And it's, I've got a short anecdote of a national outage that was one of the main cables that connected Melbourne to Sydney. And the series of events that led to that outage were, if you go back and look at it, I had to assist in how on earth this had happened. But stage one was somebody needed to do a little bypass. There was a bit of road work going on, so they put in a temporary cable around a junction just so the work could go in. And as part of that was the diverse link for this main this circuit between Melbourne and Sydney. They removed the alarms on it, and as part of doing that in our software, they put the temporary change in. That was what we call posted, was made so everyone could see it. And when the work was done, they put the cable back to how it should be, and the temporary bypass was removed. What they didn't do was put the circuit link back in on that part of the cable. So after they'd removed the bypass, that cable looked spare. And a few months later, somebody came along and said, I need a spare fiber. And they used that fiber. Now, as part of this bypass work, they'd also turned the alarms off. And the alarms came on again, and there was a cancellation of the alarm. So that fiber was cut. The diverse link was cut and used for another purpose. And then when the real outage happened on the main, suddenly there was no diverse link. And that was...
Melbourne to Sydney was lost.
Well, temporarily, yeah. And it was interesting that I got a phone call because I was working with the company at the time. And we were just developing one of our side products. It's called Hindsight, which allows you to go back in time and see what the changes were. And it would just happen to be fortunate that they'd given me several data sets to load into Hindsight. And in a matter of, it was probably half an hour or so, I was able to get on the phone back to them and say, "Hey, I've got Hindsight." The guy was telling me about it. He was clutching at straws about whether there was any older records that could be used. But not only did I have old records, I had the whole. I could rewind time and tell him exactly which fibers used to be a part of the diverse circuit, and I could see where it had been used and how the bypass had been taken away. It was all there. So, I mean, my little part was to tell him, cable ABC fiber 14 in this place, it was just outside Canberra or something like that. But, so the data's all in SpatialNet, all the fiber cables and the connections, and every change you make is now stored in this. Well, it was a prototype product at that stage. Most of our customers have got it now, so we've got this ability to go back in time and look at how things are changing, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant scenario that you've just described there, because it's more complex than a traditional cable cut where a backhoe comes through. But that's actually a chain of events that happened over a long period of time. And
it's not just
trace
one.
back and diagnose. Right.
It's not just one problem. It's a series of things. Maybe a small mistake at the beginning, but the knock-on effect, and that was. I think the outage did last several hours, but we were able to assist on that one.
Yeah. So you've just given a really brilliant explanation of a number of use cases that really help to articulate why, in this increasingly virtualized world where a lot of people just seem to be disregarding the physical and geo context and that data, I think you've done a brilliant job of explaining why they remain so relevant today.
I think it's more than just remain relevant. I think they've become even more relevant. That we're as well as network virtualization. It's a wonderful thing, and carriers are jumping on it, and it's been rolled out in many places, particularly with newer technologies like 5G. But it all still boils down to physical assets and connections in the ground or in the air, and how these circuits are actually carried, what's carrying them. And whilst there's a lot of emphasis on the logical layers that are applied over the physical parts of the network, the physical is still really important. And I think as the OSS systems that are managing this become more automated and more virtual, there's a tendency to kind of back away and just say, well, it looks good at the macro picture, but when the alarms go off and something goes wrong, you've got to have the right amount of detail to drill in and find where the real problem is. I was reading one of your blogs about the root cause analysis and how that's, you had it spot on that sometimes we're presented with a range of problems and it's trying to work out what the common point of failure may be. And if that common point of failure is actually something like a flooded hub site, it could be several components that are not necessarily, you might have several splices there and cables, or they might be in the same rack or something, but it may be actually hard from a schematics point of view to work out that they're all flooded at the same time, or the power supply's gone out, or whatever the common point is.
Yeah, absolutely. And often, I guess, they are presenting or being presented with information from multiple systems. So it may be a power management system, it may be virtualization infrastructure manager, or it might be element managers, it might be from all of these different points. Without that geo reference and actually knowing where to go and send somebody if something breaks, I think is still really pertinent today, but is often glossed over by the the virtualization of OSS and networks that we're going through. Exactly as you said, it's a wonderful thing. I believe that the challenge of fault fix, particularly in the physical sense, becomes more difficult. Right. So I guess you've spent 22 years or so with Spatial Info, now Synchronoss. How do you think that your role has changed over that time? You started off as a contractor and now chief architect. Obviously, there's been some transitions along the way.
They have, and I look back on it, and it was a really it was a good place to learn about telco systems, and like I said, we've had some really engaging customers who've. I've learned from our customers, as well as people like Tony Cotter and Jeff Lang, and some of the original people in Spatial Info who really tutored us and gave us insight. And but yeah, I moved from being a nuts and bolts programmer and down in the deep dark libraries of fiber connections and things in SpatialNet.
Scary stuff.
Yeah, and then I did a bit of a spell as a product manager for SpatialNet itself. And did a bit of team leading there, and then really when we started getting involved in NBN around 2011 and 12, I've been involved in countless little projects with NBN, but I started to really when we got to grips with Spatial Storm and our services-oriented platform and using putting automation around SpatialNet. It's my role changed from developing SpatialNet to helping people use SpatialNet, and also as you become more senior, I think it's a really important part of your role is to help nurture junior developers, and I've always quite liked training and being showing people how we think the software should work, and customers as well, and getting feedback on how the tools are performing, because it's quite it's easy an easy trap to fall into is that you think you know everything, or you've got enough to develop some solution, and really you've got to go double, triple check that you've got the right context, that the tool you actually understand how this tool is planned to be used. Quite often we find customers who have been using the tool maybe even for 5-6 years or more, that they've got some little thing they're doing with the tools that you look at it and you think either that they don't know about another way of doing it that's much more efficient, or that we should really improve that little thing they're trying to do there that's really not a good way. We can provide a better solution for that. But it's actually seeing how people are using something is often the best way of doing it, and talking to people about those problems. So yeah, I moved from hands-on developer through to using SpatialNet and trying to integrate it. And some of the projects we did with NBN were around automation and activation of customers. That was quite exciting to turn on some of these services, and as more and more customers were activated at NBN, just watch these automations scale and really manage. That was an exciting place to work at times. That there's always tight deadlines, but the Spatial Suite, SpatialNet, and Spatial Storm really have become the cornerstone of the PNI within NBN. They rely on the data in SpatialNet, and it really feeds out into the rest of their OSS.
Absolutely. And you touched on a few points there that, having seen it firsthand, I think you do a fantastic job of the training and mentoring of customers, internal teams like the testers, trainers, developers, and so forth, who, I guess the telco side of things and the visualization of the data isn't necessarily always their thing, or their background. They may have more of a development background. So getting them up to speed on the context of what it is they're developing for, I think you do a fantastic job of. And one of the other things you touched on too is getting out and speaking to customers. So over the years, I've seen a little bit of ivory tower concept happening within product development, where the product developers spend quite a bit of time just in the ivory tower away from customers, and potentially a little bit of a disconnect. And you definitely act as the interface to assist that, but also have a strong belief in developers should get out and work with customers from time to time, but not always under their nose, because that can be not so beneficial as well.
That's right. Get distracted.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
There's a balance. But look, I firmly believe if you're writing software, you need to know what your customers are doing, and that's probably the most important aspect of creating good software. Is you've got to understand what your customers are doing and the problems, the challenges that they're facing. That's front and center.
Yeah, and you have a fantastic team in there. So some real genius level people developing some of the code, who have also spent long enough in the industry that they know quite a bit about telco and GIS and all the technologies that they're developing in as well, which is great.
To have such a powerful team, I think that full credit to the people I work with as well. Yeah, there's definite standout developers who they know who they are, but they it's really, and now I'm in a role of more of an architect. I tend to be up the front end of projects where I'm there for the initial scoping phase, or the knocking the edges off it and trying to imagine how it will transpire and how a solution can work in this space. It tends to get handed on to others to kind of flesh out, but it's still really rewarding to actually see some of these features and tools be developed and come out and be useful. I really get a lot of pride out of that, and satisfaction.
And have you developed any particular approaches or techniques for starting a project anew? So being the leading edge on the project and starting it off, and how to capture that and then hand that over to other people to then deliver upon.
Yeah, the guiding principles of successful projects. I wish I really knew how to do it, but I think it's that being aware of how things fit together. I'm using that word aware a lot in context, but be present, listen, understand what you do know and what you don't know, and try and ask the right questions that open people up and get them to provide more information. But really, I think there are some pitfalls that you can look out for to avoid. They're more easy to spot. Things like, I'm like, actually, you're an ideas person as well, but I have lots of ideas, and sometimes you can get distracted by your own ideas, and you can get too attached to them, your own little babies. I think it's important to, don't not have ideas, but throw your ideas out, but accept if they're all dismissed and something else comes along as a better solution. Don't get too attached to them. But I think, the main one is keep it simple, and that,
as technologists, we often get lost in that trap. And I feel like the OSS industry as a whole, we probably make things more complex than they need to be.
Exactly. And I'm going to give you another little anecdote here. And you and I both know the person, but I'm going to try and not say his name. But we have this incredible developer who's really a really talented guy, and on more than one occasion, he's been able to develop these really efficient programs, but actually miss the whole point of the software. It's almost right, but he's spent so much time considering the conditions,
the edge cases,
cases, the failure points, what it shouldn't do, that he's actually forgotten to write the row in the table, or actually send the little checkbox onto the next part of the system. That's the whole point of the software. And I think in a way it's often a really good place to start when you're designing these solutions. Is what's the output of this? What does this new thing? What does this new feature? What's it supposed to do? And if you work back from what's it supposed to do, what's the ideal output, back to what little crumbs you've got as inputs. It's probably not even software design 101. It's where the lecturer draws a box on the great big whiteboard on day one of computer science. It's what does this thing actually have to do? But you start with the outputs, and then you draw, how can I make it happen, and where do I get my info from? What do I need to make it happen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess over the years too, you would have seen a number of key inflection points. You've talked about a few of them today, from the monolithic type software, the AutoCAD, the graph databases, and so forth. What other ones would you talk about, both historically and also perhaps the inflection points that you're seeing coming, and how you're re-steering the company and your role around those inflection points?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to try and divide it up into different ideas, but from a inflection points from our company point of view, really, there've been, in my career, there've been two big ones. A lot of our customers, which are the telcos and cable companies, mainly in the US, really, that's where most of our, and Canada, they suffered badly in the dot-com bust, which was early 2000s. Didn't really get affected by the GFC quite as much. That caused us to shrink down our company size quite a lot. So at one point, that was Spatial Info. It probably at its peak went up to about 70 or 80 people. And we had offices in Denver and in Melbourne. At the low point in 2003, we were down to probably 6 developers, and probably same again in support staff. And, it was a very small company at one point there. But in a way, that made you more dog of all trades. And you have to test your own software. You have to come up with better ways of testing. You have to design, and when there's only so few of you. And I really think it's having a look at how other people work and shifting around roles is quite an interesting thing to do as well. See what's happening within your company from different parts. But that's the company history, and then getting acquired by the American company. But in terms of our market and what's happening in the industry, I think the big disruptor at the moment is really 5G and virtualization, and probably seeing it in the news. There's quite a lot of cable cutting going on in the US, and that's people kind of switching off their old cable TV and just using streaming services, that maybe even just a smart TV itself, and maybe a wireless 5G dongle, or even 4G for some of them, or even the mobile, just plugging it in and watching on tablets. So there's a big shift there. I think really if you think of the companies, instead of the cable companies as just communication companies, it's still communication. And whilst 5G can bounce signals around and form a little mesh, there's an awful lot of fiber behind it. And from our point of view, managing those networks actually gets more complicated. I mean, the task of managing a denser network like a 5G, it just means there's more fiber in the ground, and we've got to design it, come up with better ways of designing it, manage the life cycle of these projects. There's a lot of work in it.
Yeah, even are you crossing into the in-building coverage challenge where I guess there needs to be increased infrastructure within the buildings to be able to support the higher frequencies of 5G?
Yeah, well, from personal experience, we've been in lockdown for a year. I've been working at home for most of the year. I went back into our office in Melbourne recently and sat back down at my old desk, and the year I've been away, another high-rise building's gone up beside me, and suddenly my phone hasn't got any reception, and it was like, oh. But yes, we're definitely looking at in-building solutions. There's another arm of Synchronoss is really looking at smart buildings and smart cities and the Internet of Things. So I've been in contact with them, and there's watch this space. There's a possibility of some integration there.
Fantastic. So I guess a couple of final questions is, so you're in your role, but also in your nature, you're obviously a very, very inquisitive learner. Where do you go to find your information? You've talked a lot about learning a lot from customers, but are there any particular sources of information that you find really valuable out there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's osmosis. You acquire it. I mean, it's just talking to people. And, I do read some of the journals, the trade journals, and join in the TM forums and things. But really, it's osmosis. But I think a lot of it, I'm going to say, it feels like it's common sense. That it's keep it simple. As an architect, it's yes, there are design, architecture books you read, and there's ways of doing things and patterns you can follow, and that's all good. But it's got to make sense in my head before I really want to go with it. And you've got to understand how how an enterprise bus works before you're really confident you design for it, or a JMS queue. And because I've got that programming background, I really need to see something in action before I'm confident that I want to develop with it. I think that's for me, it's always more than boxes in PowerPoints. There's always something behind it. You've got to draw on your own knowledge. But yeah, there's a large part of architecture is diagrams and schematics, but they've got to mean something. You've got to understand how the data's flowing behind it, and try and communicate it. That's one of the things that's really complicated as an architect, and even the systems designer is the systems you're trying to deal with are really, really complicated. And there are tools out there that allow you to put UML together, and Archimate that allows you to show architecture, but you're modeling and you're trying to represent really complicated systems, and lots of different interactions, and you've got to understand them first. You can't just dive in and put a few PowerPoints together and wing it. You've really got to know your stuff before you get up and present that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess over the years, you've worked with many really talented people. So for somebody coming relatively new in this industry, what are the traits or the things that you would recommend for people to develop to make them great, so have risen through the ranks like yourself?
I think the traits that have helped me are, being inquisitive and being having ideas and just thinking around things. I mean, this is going to sound stupid, but I'm a keen cyclist, and it hasn't happened, for the last year or so. But religiously before that. I rode to and from work, but giving yourself, in my case, it was 40 odd minutes on my bicycle to just let your mind go and there's maybe just toss a problem around in your head. And more often than not, when you come back to it, somehow it's easier. And, those aha moments, I can have a little aha moment. Sometimes I even dream about them. It can be in the shower, it can be on my bicycle, but I think it's just letting go, having a problem, understanding it, tossing it around for a while, and then just letting go and just letting it bubble around in your subconscious for a while. I don't know if that's a trait. I don't know how you develop that, but yes. And then not getting too sidetracked. I think you've got to remain on the same game and understand what the main goal is, and be persistent and follow through on things.
That focus on Steve Jobs, real artistship kind of concept too, I guess. All right. So we've covered some fantastic space today. Where can people reach out and find you if they've got any questions following on from this?
I mean, it's peter.dart@Synchronoss, but I'll send you some socials and feel free to contact me. Love to hear from you. And certainly if you've got physical network challenges, I'm interested. Even if you're not using our software, actually having the use cases and what people are struggling with is really interesting to know. So that's my question back to you is, if you've got some problem you want to discuss with me, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. All right. Brilliant. So thanks very much, Pete, for being on the Passionate About OSS podcast and
thank you for
spending
having me.
some time with us today. And thanks also for the audience. Hopefully you've managed to uncover some real gems in what Pete's had to say today. So thank you and goodbye.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Passionate About OSS podcast. You can find more episodes, more than 2,500 blogs, and our contact details over at passionateaboutoss.com.